Don, I'm glad that you have found time in a busy schedule to come and talk with me a bit. I want to talk about religion and science and some of the conflicts that occur, some of the ways that they can interact in a constructive way. You being in the scientific world, a biologist, not so?
That's right.
And
yes.
still practicing in that way, writing. What you have written a number of things, I know, and that I've been able to read. You writing anything now in that area?
Yes, I'm writing a book called Revisioning Science for an Ecological Age.
That's and I know that you have sort of what I might call some avant-garde ideas about science. I'm not sure that your colleagues always agree with you on some of your viewpoints on science, but you tend to be a good dialogue partner for a theologian, because you've moved beyond what I call a 19th century approach to science, which would think it's the only way to deal with the world and that the empirical method's the only way of understanding reality, and you've moved to a much more open posture which seems to allow for dialogue. In other words, it's not necessary for you just to look down on theologians as people of superstition, or to look down on religious people as being sort of infantile in their approach to the world. You have a fundamental openness, as I see it, to that dimension of reality. That makes dialogue possible, something we often haven't had. We haven't had great dialogue between religion and science through the 19th and 20th century. We really have to open that up, I believe.
Yes, and I think as what you're leading up to is that part of the problem is the problem of language. That language has become so specialized, both in theology and in science, that we don't even share a common language by which we can have a dialogue. So really the key is to try to find some sort of language basis on which we can have a dialogue without doing an injustice to our special disciplines.
Right, and when you bring up language, what we realize that a lot of the language used in both science and in religion has been thought to be rather literal. It has been, we have not had a healthy sense in either discipline, it seems to me, of myth or symbol. We've tended to see the language as literal. Now let me take a shot at that from the religion side, then you can maybe look at the literalism found within science, and I hope show me a little of the history of that. But within the world of theology, there's a sort of an unsophisticated way of thinking that when we read something in the Bible that it is literally true. Like we read about Jesus in the Acts of the Apostles going up into heaven. And the image that people have is, well, that's what happened. He went up into heaven. And then you got questions like, well, how high up did he go and when did he stop? There's sort of a feeling like heaven is up above and hell is down below. In fact, when the Russian cosmonauts went up, that was one of their comments. The first ones went up and would say, this religion stuff's a bunch of baloney. We didn't find anybody up there in the sky when we went up and looked. And that is what I call a literal reading of the Scriptures or of what the Judeo-Christian tradition is all about. It's led to a lot of problems. Rudolf Bultmann in 1941 wrote a famous essay called on demythologizing the New Testament. Demythologizing meant that modern people could no longer accept that view that heaven and God are up and that hell and the dark places are down below, that we've moved beyond that sort of cosmology or interpretation of the world, and therefore we had to reinterpret the faith as well. So that would mean part of the way we'd look at the literal reading, it seems to me, of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, how about looking at science that way and the literalism?
Yeah, so I'd say the same problem occurs in science, is that on the one hand, if you look at science as a way of controlling nature and you have formulas that can then lead to technology that gives you that control, then you're limited to a strictly rational kind of language. But if you go on and say, well, what does this theory mean? Then you're forced to fall back on myth, on metaphor. So, for example, what is energy? Well, we can define energy basically in terms of a concept called kinetic energy. You can define that mathematically with great rigor. But then you go on to say, well, what is energy? Well, then we fall back on a metaphor that, well, energy is something like a substance. We say the sun has energy, and somehow it transmits energy to the earth, and it receives energy, you see. But what a lot of people don't realize, even scientists, is, well, there's absolute void there, empty space between the sun and the earth. How does this substance go from the sun to the earth? Well, you see, that's where the metaphor breaks down. Nevertheless, we can never get away from metaphor. We need somehow the rational rigor of science, and at the same time we need metaphor to sort of talk about what underlies that rigor.
Don, can we look at it historically a little bit in terms of science? I mean, my own layman's understanding starts out with sort of an Aristotelian notion of science, that Aristotle talked about the four causes, and that was the way you could understand reality. Aristotle was very much of a biologist. I mean, he was very concerned with the earth and pragmatic things and counting things and so on. And so he thought that everything that existed had a teleology, that is a final cause, that towards which it was moving, almost drawing it forward into something. And he talked about efficient causes, that was propelling things in a particular direction. And as I understand it, that became the dominant way of interpreting reality all the way up into, well, what do I want to say, the time of Bacon, I think, and when the more modern empirical approach to science was taken over. And then that takes me through people like Newton and Einstein and so on. You want to fill that in for me a little bit, or?
Yes, all right. When we come to Newton in that regard, many textbooks give the false impression of what force is and what Newton meant by force, even take force of gravity, that gravity is somehow the cause of motion. But in fact, it's not that at all. When Newton formulated his law of gravity, on the one hand, yes, the Earth moves towards the sun, and as a result of a combination of motion, it goes around in a circle around the sun. But there's a force between the sun and the Earth. But it's not that the sun is causing the Earth to move toward it, because conversely, from Newton's law comes the sun moves towards the Earth as well. It's just that the sun is so much larger than the Earth that it's primarily the Earth moving towards the sun than vice versa. So his law is not about causality, it's simply a mathematical description of interaction.
Did he think it himself that it was a law of causality that was at work?
No, in
Newton
fact,
himself.
Newton himself. In fact, this was a major problem for him. People asked, well, how can you have the sun interacting with the Earth over a vacuum? How can that be? You have force at a distance, but in between there's nothing to transmit that interaction. How can that be? And he said, well, publicly he said, I don't frame hypotheses. But privately he felt this was a real problem with his theory, which he thought maybe someday I'll learn to understand. But in fact, modern science has never really overcome that problem. So if you stick with the mathematics, it's no problem. But if you try to conceptualize what's going on there, then you come into a real problem.
I see. Now, we often say that Newton functioned in a mechanistic universe, a static kind of universe that didn't have a feel for evolution, for dynamic change, and so on. Do you want to comment a little bit on that and help us understand that?
Yes. Well, essentially, Newton had to create a sort of a framework within his thought. And he postulated that, well, there's absolute space and absolute time, and within that we can measure space in some way and measure time, and then say from that we can derive equations that will measure motion. So that's what his mechanistic framework was.
Isn't it the image one gets is that the universe is a giant machine, right?
Yes, that's the image, though in fact that's somewhat in error as well. We really don't get to a machine-like mentality until somewhat later, really especially in the 19th century. Newton's primarily contribution was law of gravity, the idea of force and momentum. It was later that we get to the idea of kinetic energy, which is not a Newtonian idea, and then later on to the idea of a machine. So his was a mechanic-static world. Later on we got to the idea of a machine that somehow can transform the forces into something that we can use to have control over nature.
And you're saying that's a 19th century phenomenon.
18th and 19th century, but after Newton.
And that, I mean, has worked its way all the way up into the 20th century, hasn't it? I mean, I realize we got Einstein intervening here, but Einstein's theories don't really catch up with the average person for a long time. And wouldn't you say that the average person, until recently at least, would have had a mechanistic notion of the universe, or would generally see it in machine-like terms? Is that a fair statement?
Oh, yes, I think that's definitely fair. Yeah, that... Well, I think even pragmatically, we all function at the level of day-to-day living, which means we function at the level of what can be defined operationally, what can we do. And that's a very concrete, down-to-earth way of thinking. As a matter of fact, you get into religion and theology, that's much more abstract, I think, for most people.
Yes, it is. So we're talking about how religion and science have functioned in literal ways, not having a good sense of myth and symbol for long periods of time. and that what it seems like we're called upon is to de-literalize both of those fields, to move beyond them. But just take me through a little bit of Einstein here and relativity theory and quantum physics, if you can. I don't know if that's possible, but I mean, the way I understand Einstein, he introduces relativity. I mean, with Einstein, you realize there are different viewpoints from viewing the same reality, and that you get different perspectives and different results when you do that.
Yeah, well, I think what's important to realize about Einstein is, and about science in general, is it depends upon values. Now, Einstein's value was twofold. One is similar to St. Thomas Aquinas, actually, that we can understand the world rationally. But then going beyond Aquinas, Einstein would say we can understand the world through mathematical theories. And at his time, then, there were two theories that contradicted one another. One is electromagnetic wave theory by Maxwell, radio waves, TV waves, and things like that. And on the other, Newtonian mechanics. And things have gotten to the point where they seem to contradict one another. And so his value was, no, there cannot be a contradiction here. It must be possible to frame a theory that would include these two as special cases. And that's essentially what Einstein did. But what motivated him to do that was his value commitment to not only a rational understanding, but a mathematical rational understanding of the world.
And the world is fundamentally intelligible then. But it's interesting what Einstein also brought into this sense of a rational intelligibility, even a mathematical intelligibility of the world, is the sense of awe and mystery. Because certain portions of what he had to say talk about this, the awesome character of the universe, the mystery that comes with this, that to contemplate the world was to sort of almost get transposed in a way. So, I mean, there is an ambivalence there. I don't know if ambivalence is the right word, but I see a twofoldness in what Einstein was about. Do you want to bring that more mystical side of him into the picture?
Yes, I'm happy to comment on that because I think that's somewhat misunderstood too. Einstein, on the one hand, did say that there is a mystery to the world, but that we can eliminate the mystery when we create our theories and superimpose those theories on the world. And I think that's an error. I think he said there's only basically one kind of theory that we can do that. By which we can do that, and that's the rational mathematical theory, and it can be a unified theory. That was his major problem, by the way, with quantum mechanics, where it seems as that was not.
Is there something that you can say simple about quantum mechanics that we can understand here?
Yes. Well, I'm not so sure. Let's see. What comes to my mind, maybe a dramatic way of saying, is what Schrödinger, one of the formulators of quantum mechanics. Whereas before quantum mechanics, we had the view that matter was made up of molecules and molecules were made up of atoms, and we can visualize an atom as a particular thing in a particular place in the universe with a certain amount of energy. With quantum mechanics, what Schrödinger says, you can't even imagine. You're no longer allowed to imagine a specific thing. The only thing that can describe an atom is a mathematical formula, his so-called Schrödinger equation.
How does this fit in with sort of the Heisenberg principle of relativity, and that the observer already influences the experiment, and that as soon as you start to measure these small particles, you're already influencing their motion or their direction and so on?
Yeah, well, of course, that's a deep question, but Heisenberg is also one of the major formulators of quantum mechanics, and the essence of that is that when you get to subatomic particles, very small particles, the only way you can observe the particle is by means of light, and light comes in little packets of energy, photons. So when the light, when you try to locate the position of the particle in space, as well as its velocity, the very process of locating it in space, you change its position by measuring its velocity.
Doesn't a layman get out of this, at least that's what I get, that this relativity notion that there are various perspectives from which we view reality? No one of them exhausts the reality. The question is, are they focusing, is there some intelligibility that can be brought into the whole mix? I mean, that's what I think the 20th century has really come to see, is a sense of relativity, that truth is not as clearly absolute as people thought at one time. the truth ends up residing in human minds, and the human observers are culturally, historically conditioned, and they're also conditioned by the theories they bring to the experiments. So that the world simply isn't as simple as we once thought. I think that's what you end up thinking, the layman thinks, after you hear all of what you're talking about, 20th century physics and so on.
Yeah, well, I think quantum mechanics is given somewhat too much credit for that relativity idea, but to this extent it's true. Essentially what the quantum mechanics person says is that if I set up one kind of experiment, I will see light as if it were a bunch of particles, or electrons as if it were particles. On the other hand, if I set up my experimental conditions differently, the only way to explain what I observe is that light is a wave, or electrons are a wave. So what you see is relative to the experimental setup.
Right, yeah. I mean, I see that happening in other disciplines. It happened in the world of art as well, with Picasso and the Cubists. I mean, they saw that you could paint on one canvas different perspectives. And it depended on how you were viewing the particular object. And you could actually paint that on one canvas then and give that sort of notion. I see that part of the 20th century understanding as well. Well, Don, we're talking about literalism in both science and in the world of theology. Now, I think we want to move to is to say that a resurrection of the positive notion of myth and symbol. And again, let me take the theological world, and then you can say something about the scientific world. But what we've recognized now is that all religious language is symbolic, and that myth is not a bad word, but a positive word. And many disciplines have brought us to that conclusion. But when we say Jesus went up and ascended in the ascension, what we're talking about is his position vis-a-vis the Father. It means that he is the Lord and Savior, that he sits at the right hand of God and is now the one who is present to the whole of the universe and is there as a saving, powerful force. You know, the question how high up did he go has no relevance once you understand that the statement is made symbolically. And I would say that all religious language is symbolic in the sense that it points to a reality that's beyond our comprehension. It points to the one I like to call the gracious mystery, the one that is inexhaustible, and no matter how logical you are or reasonable you are, experiments you do, you cannot exhaust that reality. We stand in awe of that mystery. We stand under the control of that mystery and not vice versa. That's where I see the world of theology going, and that changes everything. Just to complete that with the idea of myth, we see myth positively as a story which illumines the deepest questions of life, which has a great power to touch not only the reason, but the imagination and the emotions as well. It's a matter of the heart. And so we see Adam and Eve as a marvelous myth, one of the truest myths ever written, that tells us about the human condition and that man's desire to become like God. And what happens when you try to exercise that kind of control? You end up in trouble. And that God's responsible for the world. God is good. That's a marvelous myth. You can read it when you're 10 years old or 60 years old and get a new meaning out of it all the time. That's part of how I'd see myth in a positive way in the world of theology.
Yes.
Now science.
Well, then science really has a difficulty here because on the one hand, if you rely on metaphor, you get into trouble because metaphor, as you say, brings in the feelings. It's the subjective way of reacting to an understanding of the world. And science has a method by which people can come to a rational consensus. Well, in order to come to that consensus, everyone has to use words in the same way. So you have to have words defined non-metaphorically, what we say operationally, or maybe a better way to say it is define them mathematically. So by defining terms mathematically or operationally, we can come to consensus. But then here's where our modern problem is. What are we to make of all this? What is our subjective understanding of scientific theories, and how can we share that with one another in different disciplines, or how can we share that with the layman? Well, if we can't rely on metaphor, we can't share that. And so that becomes a real problem. And then also the problem is, how does science relate to religion? Well, it can't unless you go to the level of metaphor.
So, do you have an intrinsic problem within science? I mean, how do you relate the mathematical description of reality to the metaphorical descriptions as we find it in science? Staying within science now, why don't you give me an example of that and show me how those two relate? Because I think the metaphor is saying something different than the mathematical symbol is, but let's test that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, again, going back to Newton's law of gravity is a nice example. On the one hand, you can be very precise to say that any two bodies, such as the sun and the earth, interact in this way. And you specify it by his law of gravity, the mathematical equation. You can make calculations and you can define all the terms very rigorously. But what is this interaction? If you call it a force of gravity, then someone says, well, what is the force of gravity? Well, then, if you try to say what it is beyond the mathematical description, you have to use metaphor, sometimes.
What's an example of that? What are the metaphors we would use with gravity?
Well, such as even the idea of a force. The word force is kind of a metaphor, like we do things, we make things. Force is something that makes things happen, or that kind of thing. Well, if you get beyond the mathematics of it, it's hard to say just what do you mean by this force? How can this force act over a distance? You see?
Does the world of science understand that when it proposes an hypothesis in language as opposed to numbers, that it is functioning metaphorically?
Well, here's maybe another example of that. Better than Newton's, it'd be, say, thermodynamics. A lot of people who even write books on thermodynamics will say, I can use the equations, but I don't understand what I'm doing. Like a lot of people would say, I don't know what entropy is. Or I've read recently in books, there's a great misunderstanding of what do you mean by heat? But we can have equations, we can measure these things, but if you go back and say, well, what do these things really mean? Well, I don't know is the answer. And that's certainly not taught. We teach the equations and how to solve problems, but not its meaning.
Mm-hmm. So it would be fairly common, in your view at least, for the world of science to miss the symbolic, mythological character of its discourse. Is that true?
Oh, yes, that's right. And then they're missing out on, I think, the ground by which they could relate to other disciplines, by just sticking to the mathematics and not focusing in on the metaphors that are really there. Then they miss out on that.
And what is going to be the advantage of seeing it in more metaphorical terms? Well, one thing I presume we would do is avoid scientism, that is, making an absolute out of the empirical method. The mathematical formulas would not be the last word. We would understand that they have some meaning, and that it's a meaning that's not easily exhausted by any particular declarative sentence or any other image that you would use to describe it, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it would help us avoid scientism. In other words, it would give the scientists a certain sense of limitation, a reluctance to pontificate as though they knew the answers to all the world's problems, right? Just like we would hope that the sense of myth and symbol would keep theologians or religiously oriented people from an exclusive feel that they've got the truth and everyone else is in the darkness. That's one of the things that ought to happen from this understanding of myth and symbol, I would think.
Yeah, and there's another, though, that's very much more practical in this sense, that right now we have a problem of communication among scientists, even in diverse disciplines, and then certainly communication between scientists and the layman, and between science and, say, the humanities or religion and theology. So if somehow we could revision science so that we could relate the rigorous mathematics to metaphor, then the metaphor would provide a language by which people in diverse areas could communicate with one another. But it must be done in such a way that the rigor of the math is not lost.
Mm-hmm. There has to be an interplay between the two.
Right.
And I would say the same thing in the world of theology. I mean, to say that religious statements are symbolic does not mean they can mean anything they want to mean. The symbolism is rooted in the culture in which it arose. It's rooted in the historical period and in the fundamental insights of the people who wrote them down, their perceptions of the religious reality. So you can't say that, well, because Jesus ascended into heaven is a symbolic statement, that it means anything you want it to mean. If you want to know what it means, you got to go look more carefully at the culture in which that was written and what the conviction of the disciples of Jesus was about him. In this case, I think it was that he is the risen Lord, and he is life-giving Spirit for us, and that he continues to be present to us. Those are not made-up statements, but could be drawn out of the milieu in which the literal statement was made. And I presume the same sort of thing would be true in science, or...
Yes, and maybe relating that a little different way, that just as in religion you need an objective description, and then at the same time a subjective understanding, so you can formulate your own insight. Likewise, I think we need the same thing in science. We need the objective aspect of science, but we have to find a way in which each person can come to a subjective understanding as well. So again, we need this balance of objective knowing and subjective knowing within the same discipline.
Yeah, and you think the same thing holds for both science and religion in this way?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
So instead of just being told what to believe, whether it be in religion or in science, you can also come to understand it in the framework of your own past experiences.
Mm-hmm. That puts a lot of emphasis on trusting our own experience, but keeping it in dialogue with a larger tradition.
Yes.
So just because you got a particular religious insight and you think it's a brilliant idea does not mean it's the final word. You have to match it up against a long-standing tradition, what it says in the sacred texts, and so on, if you're wise. Otherwise, you're liable to go off on a hobby horse somewhere and be out of line with, anything that is accurate or truthful.
Yes, I think that's the case.
Well, Don, we've been looking here at this whole area of religion and science. I think you tried to give us a little lesson there in science and in the history of science. It's hard for the layperson to understand, and as I'm listening to you, it's a good reminder that it's hard for other people to listen to theologians talk, too. And we have to keep finding our ways, don't we, of saying it in clear ways or ways that people can understand. And one of the ways we were trying to do is to deliteralize both the world of theology and science so that they can come closer together. Neither one intends to be an absolute way of looking at the world, but has a fundamental openness about it. And we do that through a positive understanding of myth and symbol. That we are symbol-producing animals. We understand reality through symbols. They are not mere contrivances, but they are our way of getting at the deepest truths. The same thing can be said of myth. Then when both religion and science remember that, then we will have a more fruitful dialogue and be effective partners in helping to create a better world.